So I've had a number of people ask me how I figure out what books I'll like or find useful anyways, which I have a few older videos that I've talked about one aspect of that a little bit, which is what I call the idea of reading backwards, which this really mostly only works for nonfiction books, but it's when you find a relatively modern book that speaks to questions you're interested in and then follow the references back to other books that it references a lot and other writers, other thinkers. But I've been thinking about like how do I do this generally, especially when it comes to fiction? And my first answer was, well, I don't do it for fiction because I can't reliably predict what I'll like, but I realize that's not correct. I can't predict what I'll like for fiction as reliably as with nonfiction, but I can still do it, and I can still probably do it better than a lot of people can. Like, my worst track record for finding fiction in terms of what I would like has been in an area that I'm not familiar with. So I have a video I talked about. There was an NPR list that I was trying to follow the recommendations, and I don't think it was a very good list for a number of reasons, and it's one of the reasons that I now am a lot more hesitant to read books that are newer than 15 years old. And then I also try to read modern literary fiction, and one thing I realized that is an issue both with literary fiction and with a lot of modern science fiction and fantasy is that there is a huge trend for grimdark, and I hate grimdark. I would much rather have something that is completely optimistic with like no darkness than grimdark, although I do prefer generally relatively like nuanced books with complexity, but just dark and gritty all the way through, I hate that. And understanding not just that I hate that, but that this is something that a lot of people today love and it influences recommendations, I think going forward makes it helpful for figuring out, like, I started reading, I didn't pull it, Anne Banks' Consider Phlebas, and I might try to finish it, but it's a long book and I'm only two-thirds of the way through. And someone asked back when I was reading comments, hey, have you read this? And I'm like, I just started and I'm two-thirds of the way through. And someone commented, oh, Anne Banks, basically he's good for torture scenes and otherwise not very interested. And I'm like, okay, that matches my experience with the first two-thirds, so I may end up not reading more of that. But in contrast, it did make me decide to finally read Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky, which I loved this book enough to then read the rest of the series. And I'll have a video on Uplift, Biological Uplift, soon probably as well. And this is one that was on the NPR list, and it's one that I kept hearing about, and I'm like, I should read it. And then I checked to make sure that it's not grimdark, which it is very much not. It can be a little bit dark at times, but compared to like the modern tastes, it's practically like The Alchemist. And this one, like I read, it's something that I keep hearing about, and until I read it, like, I would call this honestly the perfect science fiction novel, and I'll get into that when I do a video on Uplift. But the short of it is he's a good writer, like in terms of good pacing. The science fiction ideas are a good mixture of creative and sort of cliche, but in a good way. And I'm like, yeah, I think this, like, just checking before I read it for fiction, is a book that has come recommended. Is it grimdark or not? Or is it could be called grimdarkish is a good heuristic for determining a lot, especially when it's a book that I've heard a lot about from people I trust. Because there are people, I guess the other thing that you have too is you also have books that are not grimdark, but just very weird. And there's a certain taste for that I like books that are often weird, but not sort of the new weird necessarily. But that's a lesser concern than just, is the book dark? And so, again, Children of Time, I'd heard a lot about, starting with the NPR list, but possibly before then. And so that sort of falls in the category of it's something that I had heard about a lot. And eventually I went and I decided I was going to look into it. And sort of a similar case was Black Swan by Nassim Nicholas Taleb, who I talk about a lot now, especially his books Anti-Fragile and Skin in the Game. This was the book that sort of made his reputation. And I had heard about it and meant to read it, but the people who talked about it were generally sort of finance bro types who interestingly misunderstood what he was saying in here, I realized when I read it. And then the pandemic happened, and people had claimed he predicted the stock market crash of 2008, and now they were claiming he predicted the pandemic. And so I looked, and like, it's clear if you read it, like he says in the afterword, he did not predict the stock market crash, just that something like that would happen. And this edition I think I got was before the pandemic, but he also, it's clear he's like, that would be a Gray Swan example. And then I loved him as a writer, and when I finally got around to reading Anti-Fragile, I liked that even better, and then read skin in the game pretty quickly. And so this is part of a pattern of, if it's a book that I've heard a lot about in sort of the zeitgeist, in this case, addressing something specific that I was curious about, and it's sort of hard to explain, but it just sounded like this is a good book to read now, and it was. And in a similar fashion, this book, I really only had to see recommended once to read it, because it was in an Atlantic article, and in the context that it was talking about it, this was just after I had learned about how the US government had put its thumb on the scales of dietary science, and I've talked about, I gained 180 extra pounds trying to, it's sort of the nodder of my self-confidence, trying to replace all the meat and cheese I was eating with healthy starch, which I didn't think would help with the weight, but I heard it would healthier. But actually, no, the starch was worse both for health and for weight gain, and I wasn't weighing myself. And so I was sort of grappling with, okay, this has been like a failure of the sort of systems for science as we have it. And then I was sort of thinking about this in general when I saw a reference to this in the Atlantic in the context, and I read it. And this is, even for me, this was kind of an excruciating read. It is very dry and academic. And so generally I recommend his other books, especially The Art of Not Being Governed, which I had heard about before. And I didn't realize it was the same author until I was getting through it. I'm like, wait. And I looked it up. But anyways, so I heard about this book from the Atlantic, and I'm like, oh, this sounds interesting. And it definitely was eye-opening. And it's funny because I will talk to people about this book, and what I learned from it, people are like, oh yeah, that's obvious. And the people who are like, oh yeah, that's obvious, are the people who really don't get what he's saying at all, don't get the implications. And this is something you often see, is whenever people say something is obvious, especially if it takes a dense academic book to sort of get across to me, it's because they are so out of it that they aren't even understanding what it is, and they're just in one ear, out the other, I guess. So that's sort of part of a pattern of like finding books, just general, I heard of them, and then I'll sometimes also look up, try to find a book on a specific topic as well. And I've talked about this book several times, and I was looking into, because I'd read several books on bird behavior, and I'm like, I like bats. Can I find a book like this on bats? And it is kind of that, but the key thing about it that makes it really a fantastic book is this is a book about how to win over hearts and minds by educating people and by also understanding where they're coming from and meeting them where they need to be. And so I loved this book. That worked out well, and I've had mixed results with that, where it's like, I'm interested in something, let me try to find a book on it. Because often it'll address it, but it's not necessarily well written. So like I've mentioned, my third favorite animal species, or non-human animal species, is the Australian magpie. And so I was like, same thing with this bird. So I had the book on the kea that I've showed a few times, which is my favorite non-human animal species. And I'm like, can I find a similar thing on the Australian magpie? But this book is a lot less anecdotal. It's a lot more dry and academic in a way that, at least for me, made it stick less. And I might still read it because it interests me, but it's definitely not as much of a fun read. And sort of similar fashion, so going all the way back to undergrad, and I showed this book before, is I was writing a paper on animal behavior on ethology, and Wikipedia mentioned that the Nobel Prize for founding the field went to 3 guys, and I was like, can I find books on them? And this book was like just out, and it was on the collaboration between 2 of them, Konrad Lorenz and Nico Tinbergen. And so I read it, and it was really great and helpful. So that's sort of seeking out books. And after that, we're sort of getting into books people recommend and how do I decide when to trust recommendations. And I'll actually, seems kind of appropriate to maybe start with YouTube. And so I have 4 books here. So these 2 were recommended by the channel World Building Notes, who is a fantastic small channel who doesn't upload much, unfortunately, anymore. I mean, she made high-effort videos while remaining a small channel, so I totally get it. But she recommended a lot of books, and I remember these 2 in particular, because this is a great read, and it's one of the few books that I have reread. I don't reread books a lot, but I reread this because it's great, and it's very different. It's basically a story of the capital city of an empire, with sort of that as a character, and with all the humans as sort of side characters in the story of the city, which is an interesting approach that I found fantastic. And then this one fundamentally changed how I think about a lot of things, as I've realized when things scale, they rarely scale linearly. So they will occasionally, you'll have exponential returns where you put in twice the effort and you get 3 times, 4 times, 10 times the results. But most of the time it's diminishing returns, and it's often in a somewhat predictable fashion. And so, for example, when it comes to businesses, I think it's 1.8, every doubling it's like 1.85. But generally when you scale things, you run into this issue of just doesn't scale linearly. And so reading this book, it changed how I think about a lot of these things, and I tend to sort of overlook it. It was only because I was thinking about YouTube recommendations, and I'm like, oh yeah, World Building Notes recommended this to me, and it really impacted my thinking. And a similar book for this was from the YouTuber Kaiser Bouch, who does videos on demographics that I watched occasionally. And one of them, he was talking about this book and a lot of the problems with like our modern society and how we got here that I was grappling with. He talked about in his, I think it's a 20-minute review of this book, maybe 20 minutes, 40 minutes, but I watch videos on 2x speed, so I don't remember whether it was originally 20 minutes or originally 40. But anyways, so he was talking about it, and I was like, wow, it sounds like this guy addresses a lot of the questions that I have. And I'd heard about this book before from a different YouTuber who reads a fair bit, but generally, when he's read the same books as I have and talks about them, I feel like he didn't get the point. And certainly with this one, he never really conveyed when talking about it why this book was interesting, which basically the short of it is, and he's building on James Burnham's idea of the managerial revolution, and he's sort of explaining U.S. domestic politics in a way that aligns with the Nick Pardini, who has been one of my most consistently overlapped channels, Analyzing Finance with Nick, his idea of the establishment and the counter-establishment, and Francis has sort of a similar idea where the establishment are the managerial elites and the counter-establishment are the business elites, basically. I mean, it's more complicated, but that's the gist of it. And so when this video was, I'm like, I need to get this, and it looks thick, but it's like big text and a lot of spacing, so it's a pretty quick read. And I went through it, and then I actually read backwards from this book to read a lot of other books. And then this same YouTuber, who I don't want to name, but who tends to, when he reads books I read, I feel like he didn't get them. He talked about this book, and it happened to be just as I was doing TMS, so transcranial magnetic zapping for treatment-resistant depression. And I was starting to suspect, I feel like depression, the issue is just that your life kind of sucks, and you need to figure out how to get your life in order. And then, so he was talking about that that's exactly what this book said, and introduced me to the biopsychosocial hypothesis, which is basically, it turns out when I talk to my psychiatrist, like both medical professionals and researchers recognize that, yeah, it's very rare that depression is strictly treatable biomedically, if at all. It's almost always dealing with issues in your life that you need to deal with. But it's hard to tell people, hey, make life changes to make your life better, especially meaningful and lasting ones. And there is a placebo benefit to antidepressants, even if it's not clear that they work. And so it's easier to just prescribe antidepressants and hope the placebo effect works. And I have a video I recorded a while ago that I might release, so I might re-record, sort of talking about what I learned from this book. But in this case, this YouTuber actually did get the basis of what was in this book right enough for me to see this is going to be relevant. And then we also have books from like friends and people who know you. So like this book, which I've talked about before, and it doesn't show up well on screen, but Bastard Tongues by Derek Bickerton. I read this because my undergrad advisor, she wasn't officially my undergrad advisor because she was at a different school, but unofficial advisor, recommended, because I had an interest in Creole languages after taking a course on African American vernacular English and the relation of the Creole hypothesis to that. And it was fascinating in more ways than just the nature of Creoles, because it gets to the question of how language develops generally, and it also gets to interesting questions about the nature and ethics of scientific research, which I mentioned in a last video I talked about this one. And likewise, I have a friend who I've given a lot of reader recommendations to, and she's given me some. And this was the first one that she gave that she recommended. And I have been, like, I'm a Quaker, and I've sort of been grappling with, like, religious questions, because I'm a Quaker, but I'm not a Christian. I'm a Taoist Quaker. And so I'm reading a lot of books on religion, and this seemed fascinating, and it was, and I want to reread it. It's one of these books that I retained a little bit of it, but I feel like it can benefit from a lot of rereads. And then there's also, so there's books that my father recommended, and there's books that viewers have recommended, which is one reason I regret that I haven't been reading the comments. Because, so I haven't read this one yet. A viewer recommended it, or recommended, I don't know if it was this book, recommended this writer. And I got it because it looked interesting. And after this, the books I've been reading, so many of them mention, I think it's Mankar Olson. I want to say Manjur because looks kind of like a Turkish name, but I think it's not. And so I'm like, I need to read this at some point. I don't know when I'll read it, but I got it. And he wrote a bunch of other books that seem interesting too. And then a couple of other books that viewers recommended that have been hugely impactful. I mentioned this one, We've Never Been Woke. And this one I had been aware of, but it was new. And as I said, after my experience with that NPR list, I was trying to not read stuff that was newer than like 15 years generally, unless I had a compelling reason. But this person had similar enough taste that I'm like, I'm going to trust this person. And it was eye-opening. And it also led me to Bourdieu, who I started reading and kind of put on pause, but I want to come back to, with the idea of symbolic capital, which was really eye-opening for me. And then more recently, I read a book, and I think this was the one they recommended, but they recommended this writer, The Windmills of Sancho Panza by Tage Lindbaum. And so I'm like, as I'm going into deeper rabbit holes, I've been questioning some of my most fundamental long-held assumptions, and this seemed to challenge them, and I knew sort of perennialists in general did, because I watched this channel, Johan Nielsen, Political Perennialism, and he has talked about this guy a lot. He seems to be one of his 3 favorite perennialists, along with Schuon and Guénon, who are sort of founders of the school, whereas Lindbaum is newer. And I find this book I haven't read Schuon yet, I read Guénon, and I find Lindbaum both easier to read, and also I'm more agreeable to his conclusions, whereas Guénon I was more, no, I think you're wrong on this, that, and the other thing. And this is just a beautiful, in addition to being interesting, relevant to me, it's just the writing in this is beautiful. And so that was a great recommendation that I put off way too long until it suddenly became seemingly relevant. And then my father knew me well, and he recommended a bunch of writers, and sometimes he would misfire, but most of the time he was spot on. And I talked about the 3 classic, like, Golden Age science fiction writers who I think are best and have the most interesting voices. One of them is Jack Vance, who I found on my own. And then my father, when I talked about what I liked in Jack Vance, recommended Cordwainer Smith and Clifford Simak, who are both very stylistically and thematically different writers from Vance, but he kind of knew me well enough to realize what I liked about Vance, I guess, sort of is reflected here. It would not surprise me if all 3 writers were ADHD, which could be part of it. And he also recommended James Tiptree, who I want to make a video about the Tiptree Award at some point, but I talked about this book in my video on books that are sort of unusual that I recommend. I think I did, anyways. And then actually, I realized I pulled a few other books. So when I talk about recommendations, what you're sort of the pattern you're seeing is if someone who knows you well and knows your reading taste, they're more likely to get it right? Like a stranger won't know. And with the YouTube channels, like I really relate to World Building Notes. Kaiser Bouch, I think it is, recommending Samuel Francis. He just happened to hit on this is useful. And then the channel that also recommended Francis in an incoherent way, kind of, who recommended Lost Connections, he happened to explain well enough what was relevant in that book that I'm like, oh, this sounds interesting. And at the time, going through TMS and starting to suspect. The thing is, I was feeling better, but I was going somewhere every day to talk with the lab tech for half an hour. And I'm like, I feel like the reason I'm feeling better, like I suspect that this is probably because I'm driving somewhere, I have a purpose, and I'm talking to the lab tech, and not because of the TMS. And then I actually, after reading that the medications were placebo, I looked into it, and it's not clear that TMS actually works beyond placebo as well, although fortunately my insurance did cover it, because even if it didn't help, the placebo effect of going somewhere and talking to the lab tech helped me realize, oh, I actually need to start getting out and doing things. And it led to me realizing, like as an autistic person, I was looking for things that I would inherently want to do. And I realized that's the wrong approach, especially if you're so weird. Like, not many people are going to be doing what I want to do, but I should be looking for what are the things that I could do that the people doing them are going to be the kinds of people I want to talk to. And that has been a much more fruitful approach. And then finally, come back to a few books that I basically found because of Amazon recommendations, but sort of interacting with other things. So with John Gray, who I've talked about before, now one of my favorite, possibly my favorite living philosopher, Amazon was recommending him with some of the other stuff I was reading, and he kept coming up, and I looked him up. And I read that he was one of the favorite philosophers of Nassim Nicholas Taleb, who I talked about. And so I'm like, okay, if Taleb likes him, he's probably worth looking into. And yeah, Gray is like fantastic, both as a writer and for the questions I've been trying to grapple with. And then The Alchemist, which I've talked about, like I went into this knowing absolutely nothing about it at all. I don't know how Amazon thought to recommend this. And all that I knew when I looked it up is that apparently Bill Clinton and Rush Limbaugh both liked it. And I'm like, I don't like either of them, but the fact that both of them liked it is interesting and I should read it. And I think it helps that I went into it with no expectations. I think often, again, most of the people I know who are readers who have read this, not know anything about it, have liked it. But I think a lot of the critics of it, part of the issue may be going in with high expectations and then it can't live up to that. Whereas I had no expectations and loved it. And I've read some of his other stuff now. And then this one was Amazon kept recommending this to me like over and over. And I realized it wasn't a sponsored listing because obviously Amazon now especially recommends a lot of sponsored listings that are not really relevant. So this was a non-sponsored listing that Amazon kept recommending in a wide range of like different books I was looking at. And so I looked it up, and it was, the story of this book is there was a guy who was really inspired by this entrepreneur, Naval Ravikant, to the point that he got permission to collect his quotes, do a book, and you can actually get the book for free from the website. And they say, if you can afford it, please buy it. But if you can't, hey, here's the free PDF, because we want everyone to have this knowledge. And when I finally read it, I'm like, oh, this is really helpful. And then finally, Christopher Lasch, who I've talked about a lot, he was showing up with, once I started reading sort of people like Burnham, in the Amazon recommendations in that same category. And then when I read Nima Parvini's, I think it was either The Populist, I think it was The Populist Delusion, and he was referencing Gottfried, who I have not read yet, but want to read. And Princeton University Press is having a 50% off sale, which one of his best-known books is there, so I'm going to actually order that. It's until June 9th if you're interested. And I'm trying to decide, because again, I'm spending more than I earn, so I'm trying to limit my spending, where I'd buy like half their catalog, but I'm definitely going to get that one. And anyways, and so Gottfried was recommending Lasch, and the name was on my mind because I kept seeing him come up in the Amazon recommendations. And so I'm like, okay, I should check him out. And I actually started with Haven in a Harsh World, which I've pulled, like when I talked about what marriage is, talked about that. So anyways, this is a first pass of me trying to sort of explain in general the factors that sort of how I figure out what books to read. And in some ways it's kind of advanced. Like one thing when I noticed when I was a kid is like a lot of people didn't like look at author or genre at all. And so if they found an author or a genre they liked, they wouldn't read more by the same author unless it was in a series, and they wouldn't read more in the same genre. And genre is obviously highly imperfect, but it's kind of amazing to me how many people don't do that. And when I was younger, I think initially I would just pull books that looked interesting, and it took a while before I started actually understanding there are patterns, and the patterns are, if I'm recognizing it because it comes up as relevant to the kind of people I'm interested in, if it is recommended by someone who knows my reading taste, or if it comes up and it seems relevant to a problem I'm trying to solve, these are likely good metrics for figuring out it might be useful. So anyways, thanks for watching. I'm Magpie, and I'll see y'all in the next one.